Hello everyone and welcome to the Northeast Georgia History Center. It is time for Ask a Historian, and I'm Glen Kyle. I'm the Executive Director here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. And for some reason it feels like it's been a long time since I've had the pleasure of being able to sit here and answer your questions. Maybe it hasn't been that long, maybe my days have been running together, but I do really enjoy this segment. It's a lot of fun for me, it's a challenge. I hope it's fun and educational for you. I do, however, have to let y'all know that we're going to have to cut today's episode just a little bit short. We have a special ceremony here at the History Center today. A wonderful lady by the name of Cleta is coming in. We've just created a little pocket garden on the property to honor her and her late husband Marvin, who were volunteers here and involved at the History Center for over 25 years. So that is an amazing thing. Thank you so much, Marvin and Cleta, for all you've done for the History Center. Folks, what you're seeing here is in large part due to what they have done, so we are going to have to run out and cut a little short today. But be sure and wish Cleta and Marvin best wishes in the comments if you want. So we've already gotten a couple of questions. We've had a couple of mail-ins. And one is, about Labor Day. What is Labor Day? How did it come about? And, because it's coming up, right? This coming Monday is Labor Day. It's very late. It seems very late. Usually it's the first Monday in September. And the way the calendar has fallen this month, it's like the latest that it could possibly be, but that's okay. Labor, what is labor? I always like to start out at the most fundamental level of things. Labor is the thing that you do to create something, right? And usually labor is identified with creating something, working somewhere to get a wage or to create food or for yourself or something like that. It's the physical activity that you do to create something to sustain life at its most basic and fundamental level, right? And that last part, to sustain life, is really important because that's sort of the fundamental thing we all have to do, right? It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is you have to have food and water, you have to have shelter. And to provide those things and to create them, we can either labor ourselves to create the shelter, to grow the food and prepare it and consume it, or, which has become much more common and really became more common as we got into the 20th century, people work at a production job or something like that, and they are paid money, and with the money that they earn from their labor, they purchase the things like shelter and like food and clothing and things like that. There's not a lot of not self-reliance, that's not quite the right word, self-sustainability, let's call it. So as I said, this really started in the 20th century, and in the early 20th century, the late 19th, but especially the early 20th century, labor was very much being taken advantage of. The idea of those who labor, which was predominantly male, but by this point there's a lot of females involved too, right, in textile mills and things like that. The people who run the factories, who provide the actual money, the capital to make them go, are taking advantage of the system. They may not be paying very much for their employees, they may not be paying enough, but there are so many people that need a job that they feel like if someone's not happy or if someone gets injured and can't perform a job, they can just take them out of the labor pool and bring someone else in who's happy to have the job, and the machine continues to run. Well, there are a lot more laborers than there are management and owners. So labor began to get the idea that if we come together, if we begin to negotiate as a body to sort of demand things, not just from our employers, but from the government, from state and federal government agencies and legislatures that can create laws that are more beneficial. And, in the beginning, before any of these laws that we think of today as like minimum wage and child labor laws and what the work day is, right? It didn't exist. There were people who were having to work 6, 12 to 14-hour days because that was the job. And if you didn't like it, you were gone and you would get somebody else. And that's a lot of work. People were having to survive, to make enough money to survive. They were having to take their kids and have them go to the same factory they were working at, which of course precluded them from going to school and getting an education, and was also dangerous. There were some mills, like textile mills. This was not universal, but it was common. The kids were sort of prized workers because if a gigantic mill machine broke down and they needed some work to be done, the kids were smaller. They could sort of send them into the machinery and they would teach them how to do the repairs or rethread the machines. You know, these little kids in these gigantic machines, and if something goes wrong, that's a bad day for the kid. Plus just developmentally, physically, emotionally, and psychologically, it's just not healthy. So they began to agitate, they began to strike, they began to vote for people who would bring about some of these changes. Unions, of course, are one of the first big things. And then you have minimum wage laws. You have laws that restrict the work week, which all those are still in place. And then you have, those are legislative changes. And sometimes labor would get together and again, sort of make demands or negotiate with their respective employers as to benefits that they could get. No health care, right? If you're working in a machine and you got your hand caught in the machine and mangled your hand, that's tough. They would just get someone else who could do it. You don't have you don't have medical insurance, you don't have unemployment insurance, you don't have disability and things like that. So they were looking to make these things happen for workers. So a lot of the things we have today that make our jobs safer, more tolerable, more profitable, and sometimes more rewarding are a result of those early efforts to recognize the value of labor and the changes that they did. Hence the celebration of a day to recognize that, Labor Day. And ironically, of course, what do we do to recognize hard work and steady income? We take the day off. It's not the same everywhere, but that, in effect, that's Labor Day. That's what Labor Day is about. Oh, let's see. Yes, that's a good point. Which reminds me, if you are a member, or if you would like to become a member for as low as $3 a month, on Fridays we have our special members-only broadcast. And this coming Friday, 2 days from now, we're going to go into a lot more detail about not just 20th century labor and labor movements, but the history of work, right? What is work? How did people get a career? What education did they have? What type of jobs did they have open to them? That self-sustenance sort of work was the primary sort of physical activity for most humans for most of human existence. And how did that evolve into something that we have today? So if you're a member, please tune in on Friday. If you're not a member, please consider that. I'm sure that Libba is going to be able to put some information about how to become a member in the chat. What if Lenin didn't die and was still in charge of the USSR during World War II, or Trotsky was in charge? Well, first of all, Lenin would be very old by World War II. That's a tricky question. Lenin came to power after a long series of complicated events in Russia, and then which became the Soviet Union in World War I. And one of the great things that had propelled the communists to power was the idea that the war that Imperial Russia was fighting was not worth it. There were too many lives being lost, too much money. There was a focus on an external war rather than internal improvements. So when Lenin and the communists come to power, one of the driving goals that they had and that had propelled them to power from a popular perspective was the idea that they would end the war, right? They would end Russia's involvement in World War I. And so they were forced to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was incredibly bad for Russia, but they just wanted to get out of it. That changes the course of the war on the Western Front. We won't get into that right now. But so Lenin was very much about ending the war so that he could make internal improvements. He was also very, very leery of the Germans, right? And he was sort of having to create not a nation from scratch, but certainly a bureaucracy and a political system and an economic system from scratch. And the irony is that, when Marx had discussed the ideas of what communism should be and socialist movements should be, he was aimed at these things taking place in a developed nation with a strong middle class, a good solid industrial base, and things like that. So that was part of the trouble when you have Russia becoming the paradigm for this communist revolt. there is basically no middle class. There is no significant industrial base. Everyone is still agrarian. The education levels are very low, things like that. So it's hard to kind of force those ideals of Marx into a communist ideal for what Russia already was. So Lenin was having to deal with that. That was Lenin's focus. Of course, Lenin died, and the interesting thing is, I promise I'm getting there. Give me a second. I'm just trying to get some background. Lenin knew he was about to pass away, right? He's the hero. He creates the Bolshevik state. He creates the Soviet Union. And when he realizes that he's about to pass away and they're trying to figure out who's going to be in charge after him, he says, it can be anyone, just don't let it be Stalin. Well, of course, things happen, and when Lenin dies, Stalin is the one who ends up in power. And Stalin is very much a cult of personality. His ideals, his dedication to the ideals of communism were not nearly as strong as his ideals of a dedication to Stalin and to making sure that he was in power and that things went the way he wanted. And so, in the years leading up to World War II, into the war for the first year and a half because of this. They do eventually come back. They learn very much the hard way. Soviet losses in World War II, if you count civilian and military together, are upwards of 20 million dead. Dead. That's not wounded, that's dead, okay? So, if Lenin had been around, how would things have been different in World War II? This is just Glen speculating, and Glen speculating is that things would probably not have gone nearly so badly because I don't think Lenin, the way his leadership style was and the way he tried to create the Soviet government, was not going to be based on purges of potential political threats or potential political enemies. He might have removed them, but he also was a very practical man. He wanted this, he was concerned with a Soviet Union that worked for the people. So the purges that happened under Stalin, the starvation plans that happened with civilians under Stalin, I do not think would have happened with Lenin at all. At all. And as a result, the Soviet Union would have been much better positioned to resist a German invasion and a German attack in World War II, to the point that Germany may have very much given a second consideration to whether or not they should even invade Russia. I don't think Russia would have been in as bad shape as it was. That's a very long way to go about answering your question, so I'm very sorry, but that's sort of an important thing. Extracting resources for a major offensive war that goes into several different countries can make you somewhat unpopular domestically. And so a lot of people did not like the harsh conditions that he placed on them, the way he ran the army, and the way he invaded other countries, and especially Poland, and tried to take over. So in a nutshell, that's why Ivan the Terrible is terrible. That idea isn't so much that he's a bad leader or an incompetent person. It's more that the things he did were just terrible if you were on the receiving end, not necessarily on his side. Let's see. What other questions do we have today? You know, what got Abraham Lincoln interested in politics? I'm honestly not sure I can answer that. I know that as a boy, he read a lot. He read everything he could get his hands on, which means that he was having to borrow most books. And if he's borrowing books, that means he's going to be borrowing the most common books available at the day. And a lot of those are going to be general histories of the United States or of Europe or things like that. They're going to be about, they're going to be biography of some of the great leaders of the American past. And when you read those things, a lot of the history of, say, Washington or Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, or the early history of the United States, are going to be, they're going to incorporate a lot of the political activity of those people, like Washington, right? And so my speculation is that if he's going to read about these great men, he's going to want to, they're going to inspire him to be like those men, right? This is something that happens, I hope, when you're young. The things that you're young begin to inspire you, and you see things that you want to emulate. So he's wanting to emulate Washington and those early American leaders who are very political. And when he sees that, perhaps he saw that the best way to set his own course in life and to become a good American, a great man, was to emulate these people. And that meant, in effect, a political life. And another, this is not universal, but you see this happen with a lot more people than just Lincoln. If you were very poor and you were trying to make your way in the world, but you had a good mind, if you were not necessarily formally educated, but you had a strong intellect, let's say, you could speak, you could argue, you had taught yourself to read, you read a lot, lawyering was the profession for you, because that requires, interpersonal skill. That lawyering, especially this early when there were trials and things involved, was not just, as they would say, book learning, right? It's interpersonal reactions and relationships. It's making arguments in front of people using rhetoric and reason and logic and evidence. And so someone who had a good mind but perhaps not a big pocketbook could begin to make their way in the world as a lawyer. And when you become a good lawyer, people start to notice you. And the law and, practicing law and the creation of the law, the legislature, are two very similar things. And when you reach a certain prestige within your profession of law, people are going to start to think of you as maybe someone, well, if he's this good arguing law, maybe he's going to be pretty good creating law as well. And so they begin to think of you as a state legislature, and then maybe you become a representative and things like that. And so I'm sure that childhood reading of Lincoln, coupled with his chosen profession and his great success at that profession, started to push him into that political sphere. So, there you go. Oh, what would have happened to Russia if there was no Russian Revolution? Oh. Okay, so that's a good question. Let me kind of couple that with, I don't think you can avoid the Russian Revolution without somehow avoiding World War I. I think that the Great War led so, it's almost predestiny, right? That the conditions that World War I created, with Russia being a major participant, almost made the revolution inevitable. Okay, so if you will accept that line of thinking, what if Russia had stayed out of the Great War? Or even better, for so many different lives, what if the Great War had never happened? What if they were able to hold off a global conflict at the last moment with negotiation? Russia was actually well on the way to becoming a strong modern state. I've somewhat disparagingly, I've mentioned that they were still primarily agricultural. There was not a large educational base in Russia. But in the 20 to 30 years leading up to 1914, Russia was by far and was seen by other European powers as one of the fastest growing, fastest developing states in the entire main world, right? Russia was on the move. They were industrializing. They were setting up universities. Their population was skyrocketing compared to others. And as a matter of fact, that's one of the things that made much of Western Europe nervous about Russia. Well before the Soviet and the communist issue came to play, they saw Russia as so big, with so much potential manpower and so much potential industrial capacity, that England, France, Germany, Italy, Austro-Hungary, all those big powers were beginning to get kind of worried about Russia because it was growing so fast. So if the war had been avoided and the Russian Revolution had never happened, I think Russia would have continued on the path of eliminating that quasi-feudal agricultural base that it had developed, and would have industrialized very quickly, perhaps not quickly enough for those who were agitating for a communist takeover, or Kerensky or Lenin or folks like that, but it was modernizing before the war, and I think it would have continued to do that. And maybe, with no World War and no Russian Revolution, by the 1930s, they could have been competing, who knows, maybe not just with Germany and England, perhaps with the United States as far as population and industrial capacity goes. And maybe we would have ended up with another Cold War with Russia anyway. Who knows? Let's see, why do so many vice presidents run for president And why do so many of them win? That's a good question. There's a lot to it. The last time I looked at this, which was several years ago, I want to say that someone who serves as, if you look at just the pure statistics, someone who serves as the Vice President of the United States has a 25% chance of becoming president, right? So for every 4 people who are vice president, one of them will eventually become president. Whether that's through the president dying, whether that is them being elected or anything like that, it seems like a 1 in 4 chance. So part of that is simply being close to the game, right? If you're the vice president, you're not really making the calls, but you're being identified as the chief politician of the United States. You're going to notice the vice president when it comes to talking politics and things like that. And also, a president usually picks their vice president for the support they can bring them in a general presidential election. Whether they're coming from a state with a lot of electoral votes, whether they're someone who sort of supports the platform that the president or potential president seems to espouse, they've already made their way pretty far into the party by that point, right, into their respective political party. So as a result, they're kind of on their way. So the vice presidency is seen as a very prestigious role, and it's seen as sort of a stepping stone. And when you start looking at the history of people who have been vice president, there are a lot of them, right? John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Martin Van Buren was Jackson's vice president. Lots of, pulling it on into the modern world, Lyndon Johnson, George Herbert Walker Bush. Yeah, Gerald Ford was the vice president. So lots of modern presidents, Harry Truman, lots of vice presidents have become presidents. So it's just being connected to that central presidential thing, and name recognition. And when presidents pick their vice president, perhaps not a part of the process is that they and their political party, respective political party, are sort of saying, here's the person next in line that we would choose to be president, right? And so not only in case of something bad happening to the president themselves, but if that president runs out their terms, they're sort of the party elect to be the successor. That's good leadership, good organization at government levels or any kind of organization. You're going to set up a succession. That's one of the surest things you can do to provide stability in a business or in a government. That's why a vice president very frequently gets to the Oval Office themselves and gets the big seat. Tell us about the purpose of the Electoral College. That almost sounds like a trap. It's come under a lot of flack lately. The Electoral College, originally as set up in the Constitution, was a way to sort of act as a filter between what Adams would call the hot and changing tempers of the people, to filter that through into making sure that there is a stable government. Quite frankly, today we use the terms republic and democracy very interchangeably, right? We live in a democracy. The Founding Fathers, when they were writing the Constitution, do not remotely see those two as the same thing. They just don't. Democracy is something where a wide part of the citizenry has a direct say in how the government works, right? A republic, a representative republic, is people from the nation state electing who will represent them for a set amount of time. They're basically, rather than the idea of a democracy is that everyone has a say and everyone can pick what happens with the government. A republic basically says, we're going to choose who it is that rules over us, right? And so you're going to choose, as Hamilton would put it, the wise, the rich, and the well-born. So when set up, that was the Electoral College, number one. Number two, it was part of the compromise between the big states and the small states. And when I say big and small, I mean population-wise. So, you know, an electoral vote is going to have a lot of power behind it, and it's going to protect areas where there may not be a lot of people from being a tyranny of the majority. Again, remember, this is the founding fathers who are worried about a tyranny of the majority. So if, you know, I'm just for an example, if 50% of people in the United States live in New York and California, right? And 50% live everywhere else, then two presidential candidates are going to really only campaign in those two states. And those two states are going to determine who the next president is for the other 48. So the Electoral College, as set up, is a way to sort of prevent that tyranny of the majority, to make, to prevent a large population center, a confined population center, from being able to have an out of proportion say over a larger part of the country. Now, there are critics to the Electoral College. Some people say, well, that makes the votes of those who live in a sparsely populated area actually count more than those who live in a highly densely populated area. Well, I can see where that argument can be made, but remember, a sparsely populated area like South Dakota, right? They're only going to have so many electors. The more populous areas are still going to have electors, more electors based on population. The members of the Electoral College are all based on population. So California and New York are still going to have a lot of electors. But the way it's spread out, it's going to prevent a concentration of democratic power. And I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms and counterintuitive. But again, you know, demos, the people, I'm trying to think of the philosopher who said that, you know, one by one, humans are fantastic, but when you get people together, nothing good ever comes of that. What influence do I think the foreign military leaders like Pulaski and Kosciuszko had on the outcome of the Revolutionary War? There were a couple of different ways to look at that. First of all was their direct involvement, right? Their actual battlefield presence, like Pulaski and Kosciuszko, and of course Lafayette. But I know you're asking about those two not as famous guys. They came, most of them came with a previously existing military experience, right? That is something that a very young United States Army, Continental Army, desperately needed. Leadership experience, organization experience, and in the case of Kosciuszko, engineering experience, right? Military engineers are incredibly important people at determining fortifications and sieges and where to place the artillery and building bridges and things like that. So they themselves individually are bringing skill sets in numbers that, quite frankly, don't exist in the Continental Army, not in significant ways. So they're bringing that, number one. Number two, beyond they themselves, the idea that they are coming from other countries, right? Kosciuszko was Polish. Pulaski, I think, was Polish too. Lafayette was French. Baron von Steuben was from Prussia. So you see, it's obviously not formal support of the American Revolution, but you see people of prestige in other countries coming to fight for the causes for which the Continental Army has dedicated itself, and their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And it lends a strong sense of legitimacy to the American cause that makes it very difficult for the British to win propaganda wars, right? The propaganda battle for the British was very, very difficult during the American Revolution. And when you have lots of these international folks coming in, just like you would be today, right? When the international scene seems to support a movement, it has a lot more political capital, let's say, and moral capital on its side than someone who doesn't. So those are a couple of great ways to talk about, or to bring about those two men. Let's see. Persia was a country during World War I. Why not now? Was it? Persia, a country named Persia, was basically not around in World War I. What you had was an area controlled by the Ottoman Empire / the Turks, right? After the war, it becomes Turkey, but at this time, it's the Ottoman Empire. And here's the fascinating thing about, here's one fascinating thing about World War I that a lot of people don't appreciate because, especially here in the United States, but in other places around the world, we have on tunnel vision about World War II. World War II is the thing, World War II is the bomb, this is the most important thing ever, we have to focus on World War II. And it was big. It was bigger than World War I in terms of sheer numbers involved, yes. But World War I, the outcome of that, I would argue, had a far greater impact on the world we live in today than World War II. Because there were so many empires, so many countries that had been around for 500-600 years that at the end of that war ceased to exist as entities, as political entities, as kind of as cultural entities, right? The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburgs, 1918 ceases to exist. It spreads apart into a lot of little countries. The Slav states, they create Yugoslavia, right? That has a huge set of problems. The Ottoman Empire, Turkey, the Anatolian Peninsula, down into Palestine, over to where Persia is now and what's now Iran and Iraq, right? The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that cradle of civilization, and all the way down approaching India, that was the Persian Empire, but the Ottomans had taken it, and the Ottoman Empire, in effect, starts to crumble it started before the war, for about a century before the war, but the war really literally put the nail in the coffin of the Ottoman Empire and led to the modern state of Turkey, but all those territories had been won by the Western powers in the war, and so at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, world leaders, by world leaders I mean those of the United States, Britain, and France, sit in a room with pencils on a map and they start dividing up territory. That's where you begin to get what's now Iran and Iraq and Saudi Arabia and Yugoslavia and Croatia and so many other areas that are Korea that have created so many international political situations and problems today. And those areas were considered mandates. You know, France wanted to control this part, Britain wanted to control this part, and they weren't really countries. They were they weren't really colonies either. It was a weird situation. But the people in those lands who began to struggle and try to find their own way and create their own countries over the course of the next 50 years really created a lot of conflict, a lot of troubles for those people who lived there, a lot of misdirection, and a lot of lost opportunities because of the great powers sort of having their way. So that's kind of why Persia was not a country in World War I, but why Persia proper sort of ceased to exist totally after that time. It was like Iran and Iraq, really, those should be Persia. Those were the core of the old Persian Empire. And now they're two countries that have been at war more than they've been at peace since 1945. Why does the Constitution allow Canada to join the United States at any time? Because we want it. We want it a lot. We always have. Let me contextualize just a little bit. During the French and Indian War, of course, what is now Canada, especially Quebec, right? It's still primarily a French-speaking area. It was French. It was a colony of the French crown, of France itself. And long story short, during the French and Indian War, Great Britain conquers all of Canada, which it now had, all of the French territories in North America, which includes Canada, which includes some areas in the Mississippi, and of course continues to include the original 13 colonies that had been established by the British. So that's number one. Number two, and put yourself in the mind of 1775, Quebec and Georgia and Florida, they're all British colonies, right? Some of them used to belong to France, but they're all still British colonies. So when the Americans listen, see, I'm doing it now. When the British colonies began to foment for their independence and began to agitate for that and fight for it, they thought, well, why just be 13? Why not be 14 or 15 new colonies? And so they wanted desperately for the Canadians to join them in the Revolution and fight against the British. And the Canadians sort of looked south of the border and they're like, no thanks. The British seem to be okay. We'll just do this. And so America, a force from America, under Benedict Arnold, invades Canada and tries to take Quebec in 1776. It fails. The war happens and the Americans win, but the British colonies in the former New France decide to stay with the British Empire, Canada, Quebec, those areas. So the new United States is formed, and they write their Constitution, but they're still holding out hope, right, that the Canadian colonies will eventually come in and create a pan-North American country. That's the hope, which is why in the Constitution it does allow Canada or Canadian provinces to enter into the Union at any time. During the War of 1812, we marched north and tried to take Canada again, and sadly again failed. So Canada has remained an independent country as part of the British Commonwealth. But Canada, third time's a charm. We're going to come for you eventually. What's next? What did the Pilgrims already know about Native Americans before they came to the Americas? That's a good question. I cannot speak, I haven't read journals about what the Pilgrims themselves knew of or thought about Native Americans before they set foot on North American soil. But I can tell you sort of what the general English perception of the Native Americans was. It was a weird mix between offensive and flattering, between dismissive and mystical. Because all they had to go by, of course, right, were written stories. Remember, no pictures, no moving images, no recordings, only the drawings that people who had gone there had done, or people who had heard about it and drawn the pictures in England. That's the only pictures you have, and all you have are the stories that are certainly going to be filtered through a lot of different lenses of English people. So England at the time understood the noble savage, right? The noble savage of the New World, and they saw them as primitive, as technologically backwards, as sort of emotionally speaking children compared to British people, and yet they also sort of held they and their lifestyle, their culture in awe, and almost a sort of jealousy, because here are people who, though they may be primitive, seem to live as one with each other, with the land, with the spirits of nature. They are, and this is very biblical, by the way, so that the British are looking at the stories of Adam and Eve, right? That in paradise, in a literal earthly paradise with lots of food everywhere, and it's a wilderness, and the people, Adam and Eve, are so free and so innocent, they don't realize the evil of being naked, right? As the Bible goes. Well, here are the Native Americans who are living in this very interesting parallel to that. It is, compared to much of England, a paradise on earth. There are exotic plants. They seem to live in harmony with the earth. They're running around mostly naked, and they don't seem to care. It's not an issue. So like I said, so the English had this very interesting duality of views about Native Americans. And so, I'm sure when the Pilgrims were reading about them, they weren't sure whether to convert them to the British faith, or perhaps maybe since those people were already so close to Adam and Eve, maybe we should convert to their lifestyle. And there was some scholarship about 15 years ago that really began to look at, there's a great book called The Invasion Within, and it looks at all these accounts of British colonists from the time of the Pilgrims, right? From like late 1500s, early 1600s, mid 1600s, of all these Englishmen and women who had gone over to the New World, to New England, and had interacted with Native Americans and had found the culture and the lifestyle so different and so freeing and so admirable that they ditched this European way of life. And a lot of people, more than we initially thought, went, if you'll excuse the term, went native. They went over and began living with the Native Americans in what that they considered an earthly paradise. So it's really neat with that. So folks, again, I apologize. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. We're going to go see our dear friend Cleta. Next Wednesday, I've already mentioned our members-only broadcast this Friday about Labor Day and the history of work. Next Wednesday, Fantastic Marie is going to be sharing a story about American Dolls and some of the history behind how that series of, I don't want to say toys, that almost sounds diminutive, but they're toys. They're fantastic toys, right? They're American Dolls. And each one of them is based upon a historical character or a historical experience. They're absolutely fascinating. So many folks have gotten into history because of these dolls, and Marie's going to be talking about the history behind them, how they came to be the sensation that they are, and what kind of, who knows what kind of future American Dolls hold. Folks, that is sadly and unusually all the time we have here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. I want to thank all of you again for tuning in. It's been so much fun. And if you are a member, thank you. If you are thinking about becoming a member, think a little harder and follow that link in the chat. But until next time, please stay safe and take care.